Olá, bom dia.
Hello, good morning.
A minha apresentação é sobre... Tá bom. Sobre metas de inflação.
So our presentation today is on inflation targeting. I'm going to try and argue today with you, saying that this kind of monetary policy that is today considered the state of art in terms of monetary policy is no big news, and it's not effective at that in order to prevent cycles, boom and bust, and credit boom and bust cycles. This presentation intends to cover the definition of inflation targeting, to give you historical examples of monetary performance from some developed countries. We're going to talk about some other historical elements and try to reach some conclusions. In 1971, Nixon defaulted on the Bretton Woods Treaty and severed the link still existing between the US dollar and gold by closing the gold window under which US dollars were redeemable by central banks, in which the Fed enabled other countries to redeem their currencies in parity with gold. Ever since money was introduced in our society, this was the first time in which the world was only left with fiduciary currency and floating currency and floating exchange. The only anchor for currency was a nominal one that should be implemented at the domestic level. At this time, so when Bretton Woods Treaty was uncomplied with, then in 74, the Bundesbank, and in 75, the Swiss Central Bank, and then after that, the Canadian Central Bank, they started stating targets for the expansion of monetary aggregates, trying to indicate to economic agents what the inflation would be to be expected by applying quantitative theory. That was the first effort to create this nominal link with the international monetary system without any ties to gold, however weak this link could be. But central banks never managed to comply with their monetary expansion targets. And so, due to political pressures, they were forced to not comply with them, and this jeopardized their credibility. Only in 1990, New Zealand adopted explicit reference not to expansion of monetary aggregates, but to an aimed price level measured by a price index. That inflation targeting policy, in a narrow sense, officially began with that. In a strict sense. Current chairman of Fed,
ainda na sua posição de acadêmico,
Bernanke,
ele
Mr. Bernanke,
descreveu
described
metas de inflação
inflation
como
targeting
uma estrutura
as a
para a
framework
política
for
monetária
monetary policy
caracterizada pelo anúncio
characterized by the
público de
public
metas
announcement of
quantitativas
official
oficiais
quantitative
ou uma
targets
amplitude de meta desejada
or target
para a taxa de
ranges
inflação
for the inflation
sobre
rate over
ou mais
one or
horizontes
more
de
time
tempo
horizons,
e pelo reconhecimento
and by
que a inflação
explicit
baixa e
acknowledgement
constante
that
é a
low,
principal
stable
meta
inflation
da
is
política
monetary
monetária
policy's
a longo
primary
prazo.
long-run goal.
Desde os anos 30,
Ever since the 30s,
na tentativa de
trying
classificar diferentes políticas monetárias,
rate different monetary policies.
uma das divisões de categorias que mais se usa é a
One of
divisão
the
entre políticas
major
de
classifications is the
regra,
division between
políticas regradas e
rule-based
políticas
policies
discricionárias.
and discretionary-based,
Padrão ouro,
discretionary
por exemplo, é uma
policies.
regra. Quer dizer,
For example, the
ele
gold
estabelece
standard is a
como
rule.
que se pode produzir moeda,
It establishes how you can produce
moeda
currency
mediante a existência de
upon
depósitos de
the
ouro.
existence of gold deposits.
O Bernanke,
Bernanke,
caracterizar
as he characterized inflation rate targets as a framework, he was trying to escape from this categorization. It didn't want to accept the idea of inflation target policies as discretionary, because there are many works showing that as discretionary level increases, then uncertainty also goes up. So that's a way that had been attempted in the past, and he didn't want to get stuck in terms of what the Fed could do. So he said this was not a rule, it's not discretion, this is a framework. That's what he tried to convey in his statement. And the key elements of inflation targeting policies, there are two key elements actually. First is that the central bank has a high level of discretion to use the tools that are available, and it also has a formal commitment to keep low inflation. The first part, there's the idea, the first element shows the strength of the central bank and conveys the idea that the authorities are committed to low inflation.
Abrir a caixa de maldades, como a gente diz aqui no Brasil, quer dizer, tudo que ele pode fazer
it shows everything, each bad thing they can do,
o compromisso formal,
how mean they can be, let's say. And the second element
então seria a justificativa
to keep low inflation would be the justification
e bordar.
So they can do whatever they like.
Entre as coisas que o Banco Central pode
Among
fazer,
the things that the central bank can do
para influir
in order to influence
de inflação como medida
inflation
por índice de
rate
preços, a gente vai
as
chegar lá
measured
em
by
seguida.
a price index, and we'll get there pretty soon.
Expandir ou restringir a
They
oferta
can
da base-
expand
restringir a
or
base monetária, ele pode aumentar ou baixar a taxa de juros básica
They can
da economia,
increase
ele
or
pode impor
diminish
controles de câmbio, alterar o nível de reservas
inflation rates.
dos bancos
They can
comerciais,
change
alterar
commercial
a
banks.
classe dos ativos que
They
as
can change the
condições
classes of
pelas quais ele vai
assets and the
conseguir
conditions under
desconto.
which they're going to give
Ele pode impor
deductions and
novas
discounts. They can impose new
regulamentações,
regulations.
bancárias.
They can
E
expand
tudo
or contract
isso,
money
os defensores
supply.
dessas políticas dizem ajuda a criar as condições
And
psicológicas
this,
para que
the
a
advocates
meta
of
de
such
inflação seja
policies say,
alcançada.
create the psychological conditions to actually achieve.
É possível até
its aims.
praticar metas de
It's even
políticas de
possible
metas de
to
inflação
practice
usando uma regra.
inflation
A Taylor
targeting
Rule,
policies using a
que
rule.
é uma
Taylor Rule,
regra onde se estabelece uma meta
that is a
nova,
rule for
de
a
taxa
mobile
de juro básica na economia,
inflation targeting
dependendo
policy, depending
de qual foi
on
a inflação.
what the inflation was.
É uma regra.
is a
E
rule.
muitos bancos centrais
And many central banks
adotaram
have
políticas de meta de
adopted
inflação,
inflation
aplicando
target
essa
policies
regra.
by
Mas
applying
uma
this
coisa
rule.
que acho que é importante ter em mente
And one thing that is important to
que
keep in
Taylor
mind
Rule
is that
não
Taylor
é,
Rule
inflation targeting.
is not inflation targeting.
Embaixo do framework do inflation targeting,
below the inflation target framework, among other things, you may try and follow trying to link the basic interest rate to the recent inflation rates.
O caso é que os defensores dessas políticas de metas de
inflation targeting policies
argumentam que
argue that
não são
rules
uma proteção
are not a protection against changes in monetary policy, that changing circumstances requires changes in rules, and that even gold standard is not a guarantee of stability in the production of currency, because a country may leave the gold standard if it needs so, as history has proven so many times.
Então, as políticas monetárias
so monetary policies
são todas discricionárias,
are all discretionary to a certain extent.
Alegam os defensores de políticas de meta de inflação,
and the proponents of inflation targeting policies say that the best you can do is to create a nominal link, nominal anchor, that ever since 1990 began to be used in New Zealand.
Vamos chegar aqui em seguida. Então, com diferentes graus de formalidade e de compromisso,
considering the different levels of informality and public commitment, targeting, inflation targeting by authorities then became the common practice. And as I said in the beginning, this is considered the best you can do in terms of monetary policy today. Low levels of inflation that have been historically reached upon inflation targeting seemed to prove this thesis ever since inflation targets started being used, then inflation rates started going down, and people thought that's about it. But the beginning of the recent financial crisis challenged this consensus, of which the Austrian countries were never part of, the Austrian school followers. These two slides, what I'd like to call your attention to, I mean, these are price changes, consumer price changes in these countries, the US, Canada, Japan. And what I'd like to call your attention to here is basically 4 periods, different periods. This period from 70 to 73 is a period over which there was still a little bit of the Bretton Woods Treaty